In tonight's show, we continue our discussion on the trivium and discuss the quadrivium with Gene Odening. Here we continue to learn about learning, logic, critical thinking, Hegelian dialectics, Plato, the trivium, the quadrivium, the seven liberal arts, and many other facets of human cognizance. Gene, welcome back to Gnostic Media Research and Publishing's podcast number 50. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Jan, and thanks for having me back.
I really appreciate our in-depth discussion last week, and I'm excited to dive right back into this. Would you like to start out by giving a little bit of a recap on what we covered last week?
Yes, and I'd like to say that although this may appear in depth, it's really just an introduction. But it's a fairly a good review as to what you can expect once you do start your studies. So I'll quickly recap what, in order of importance, what we're trying to achieve with the seven liberal arts, with the trivium and quadrivium. Number one is we're trying to discern reality from unreality. And it's through the trivium, which the three subjects that are involved with the trivium are actually the art and the science of the mind. We're concerned with training the mind how to think and how to creatively express itself. Now with the quadrivium, which we really haven't covered yet, we could say that this is really the art and science of matter. It has to do with the measurement of matter. This is the realm of extension. Now, mind, of course, doesn't have extension. But when we get into the quadrivium, we tie mind and matter together. Now, Pythagoras, who was trained in the ancient world along a path of the mystery schools, starting in India, going through Mesopotamia, Persia, and finally to India. And it's in India where he got his final initiation and became a master of mind and matter. So he returned to Crotona, which was close to his home, which was in Italy at the time, and started the Pythagorean school of the Orphic mysteries. And they had their own initiation based on Indian initiation. And their own studies based on the trivium and quadrivium, which he himself put together. Now later this evening, after we review a bit of the trivium, continue with our discussion on the trivium, we'll discuss how the quadrivium was put together by Pythagoras and how he brought it to a common denominator in the way that he organized it, and it'll become self-evident as to how what a high level of thought he had been brought to through his trek through the mystery schools. And I guess that's a good segue. We've decided, you and I, that we might have one more interview, and this would be a good segue into a preview of the mystery schools. Tonight we're just going to continue with our trivium and quadrivium discussion, which is the art and science of mind and matter. Those both lead to the development of our head thinking, our brain thinking, our critical and creative life. But of course there's another aspect to life, and that's our emotional life. So without reference to the mystery schools, we can't complete the circle of our education. So the mystery schools really go to heart thinking, as I say, our emotional life. And one of the very important ingredients of that is the initiation through entheogens, through coming to know whatever part of the mind it is that we go into. A lot of people have called it the unconscious, the subconscious, the ethereal realm. Who knows? All we know is that we can go in there get a lot of information and insight that we really can't put into words. It's not that rare an occasion not to be able to put things into words. For example, just the results of our five senses. To try to describe in words something that occurs every day, which is sight. Now, if you try to describe what sight is to a person who has all his other faculties, has his other four senses, but he's blind and has been blind since birth, words are inadequate to describe this very mundane, ordinary, everyday thing. What is sight? So the same with all the senses. None of the senses could be described in conceptual terms, in words, to a person who's never had that particular faculty. So to think that the place that we go to, the journeys that we take with entheogens are experiences that we can't put into words is not to be considered mysterious by just making that analogy to the senses. There are many things that we cannot define. In fact, not being able to define something is the essence of proof. Now, we'll get to the point where we'll be able to discern between proof and substantiation. But we'll get to that as we go through some of these commentaries on the trivium. So in our next session, we'll distinguish the cultures.
Okay.
How the mystery schools began cities. How the temple religion started to build cities around themselves, and it's from the person who belongs to a city, a civilian, which we now call a citizen. This is what named its what lent its the origins to the word civilization. So there were city dwellers, and this became the culture of civilization. Now, to this day, we still have cultures among us that are what we call uncivilized, and that's a good description, but it's also an emotionally charged word. And those are the cultures of the clan and the tribe, who have never put together a temple religion to gather people from an area around them. Now, there's only one civilization if you take it back to its genesis, and that I'm going to call right here the civilization of Lemuria and the civilization of Atlantis. Now, we'll use those as euphemistic terms that they just relate to something, but the more mature of those two civilizations, and I don't know if it's the oldest, I'm just saying that it's at times a little bit more mature than the other, is the one I call Lemurian, and that is the Chinese civilization. The cities that they built up, not necessarily around temples, but as is often the case with a mature person, they want to have their time to themselves. And China has been known for this, not wanting to mix with the culture that's outside of its own realm. And the Atlantean civilization is really the one that we belong to. We're a subculture of India. This is the culture that came out of India and spread westward for the last 6,500 years or so, and has taken over the civilization of the world. and you can trace it. All you have to do is follow Pythagoras's trip, his tour of the mystery schools backwards. The last one to do this of note was Alexander the Great. If you follow his path of conquest, it follows the path of Pythagoras back to India. When he was initiated in India, he comes back and brings what we call Greek civilization to that part of the world, but in fact it is the Atlantean civilization. And it's this westward civilization toward the Atlantic Ocean is the reason I refer to this as Atlantean. But from the Middle East up in through the southern part of Europe and then into Europe in general, and then of course over to the Americas. And now we're seeing these Atlanteans go home. They're going home to India. So they have circled the globe with their ideas. And if you look at our culture with an open mind, which the Trivium will help you to do, you'll be able to see that virtually all of our concepts in religion, society, and science, all of them, have come from India. Now that there's enough translation of Sanskrit in particular that's making its way to us, it's very easy to see if you just open your eyes to similarities. We are people of pattern recognition. And if we look for similarities rather than differences, now the differences are promoted by various entities and organizations within our culture.
Yeah, and that was
us not look back there.
That was the same idea that we had behind astrotheology and shamanism, was looking at the similarities. But I had seen a video recently, I think you had referred it to me, this doctor, professor was discussing Sanskrit and the similarities. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, his name was Dr. Brown. I can't recall his first name. But that's exactly, he was a Sanskrit scholar. And that was one of the places that I came upon this idea of similarity rather than difference. And the Vedas, of which he was very familiar, describe all the things that we know in Christianity. For example, the Trinity. In the Hindu scripture, they have a Trinity also, and it's made up of the God of creation, the God of sustenance, the God of life. In other words, creation is birth, the God of sustenance is the God of life, and the God of death is the end of life. And then, of course, you come back to the God of creation again. Brahma is his name. And you experience rebirth, and then that period of sustenance, which is life, and then the period of death. Now, to the Vedic scholars, this is what they saw around them all the time. This was when they chant Om, Om, we've all heard that, especially the Buddhist monks as they chant together. It's a very powerful sound. And they
it's like
call
they're
that,
creating the universe with that or something.
It's called the sound of the universe, because that's what the universe is. It's birth, life, death. Birth, life, death. So everything you observe is that action. And the Vedic poets who made these observations decided, well, this is too abstract. So what we have to do in order to understand this more deeply is to personify it. So we'll name the principle of creation. We'll name it a person named Brahma. The principle of sustenance we'll name Krishna. There was actually another name originally. It just doesn't come to me. But finally, the principle of dissolution or death is named Shiva. And then they made up personal stories about this. Well, our egos, man's ego, can more easily take in this idea of a personal story. And that's where these gods were created. Now, if you come forward to the Christian Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you can actually get more by the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, by the way, is more akin to the aspects of the trivium. But the word God in English, just God, G-O-D, G is the principle of generation. O is the principle of operation. D is the principle of dissolution. So it's the same Trinity that was put together by the Vedic poets. Generation is birth, operation is sustenance or life, and D is death or dissolution. And there's our connection to the Atlanteans. And that's only one. When we get to science, which we'll get to in the last section that we speak of the trivium this evening, we'll discuss that a little bit further. So what distinguishes the civilization from the clan tribe culture is man's relationship to land. For example, in civilization, land is looked at as being for man. That is, land is for man. In the uncivilized, so-called culture, man is from the land. So the idea of ownership or property is not present there. In civilization, the idea of ownership and property is present. So the Lemurians, and this is why I call them more mature, use that as a filter. The Chinese would look out amongst their neighbors to the west and decide if they were civilized, if they were starting to gather into a city, not into a tribe or a clan, but into a city, taking diverse members of tribes and clans and making them part of the owners of the land. They've got this idea of ownership. So as we go along through civilization, we see that this idea of a property and the expansion of property is taken up with more enthusiasm through India, and they moved westward. And actually, the westward movement is not an accident. Of course, China was to the east, but westward is the easiest way to navigate over water and through the desert. You only travel at night through the desert. And it's much easier to steer on a western star than it is on an eastern star, because the star can be higher up in the sky. You can follow one star through the night with a higher declination, it's called. It can be higher in the sky, and then you follow it into the western horizon. Eastern, it cannot. It can come up, but you can't follow it up into the sky. It uses its usefulness after a certain degree up, and I alluded to that with the 5, 3, 4 Pythagorean triangle on the ship and mast that was used by ancient mariners. But at any rate, that's just one tie-in as to why the migration was westward. But about 6,500 years ago, this idea of ruling the world came into someone's mind, and that was the big idea. That was the enterprise that was coming to be. And they used some of their knowledge of geometry to decide that they could tame this globe, which they knew it to be a sphere, by symbolically squaring it off, by making a cube of it. And when you have squared something, you've standardized it in the terms of one of the aspects of the mystery schools, the Freemasons. And this is symbolized, of course, when you graduate, say, from high school. Your round head is put under a square board, and you're now a square person. You can take your square head.
You're a blockhead.
You're a blockhead. You're a brick in the wall. Pink Floyd made allusions to that in one of their
another brick in the wall, right?
Well, they made an entire album called The Wall.
Right, and the lyrics are, all in all, you're just another brick in the wall.
Another brick in the wall. And this is see, you're being standardized. You're being standardized by these Atlanteans. And Atlanteans I'm using as a term because it doesn't have an emotional charge to us, like Freemasons or Zionists or
Illuminati,
and on and on and on, which are all just front men for whoever these people are. And in the final analysis, it really doesn't matter who they are. What matters is what they hold in their mind that you can come to hold in your mind, and either decide to continue to be a block in the wall, or decide you don't want to build the wall anymore and become your own person. So at any rate, we're going to study this a little bit more in our next session. And right now we're living, as I say, we're living through this the final stage of squaring the globe. We're putting a cube on it, and the word that we're using for it nowadays, so that we can blame one of the front men rather than the people who are actually doing it. If we want to blame anyone, it's called Zionism. That's what Zionism is. It's squaring, it's cubing the sphere of the world to a standardized plan. So I don't think a lot of people will be able to follow my argument until they've had their mind open a little bit more, until we go through a little bit more of the trivium. And those listeners who are more curious can take up the study on their own. Toward the end of the program, I'll provide a little package that I'll be happy to send to people that gives the sources, gives the various books and recorded lectures, and some websites that you can follow to get started on this little journey. And when we come back to this idea of Lemuria and Atlantis, we can look at it with less prejudice. So that's going to be the goal between now and then. So right now, why don't we just get back to a little bit more of the review of the fallacies, because this is the one part, the one of the four parts in logic. We're in logic now, in the discipline of logic, that is applicable almost immediately, and this goes directly to critical thinking. So we'll take our little trek tonight from critical thinking and finish up with creative thinking before we move on to the review of the Quadrivium. So we left off last time with ad ignorantium. Tonight, let's start with appeal to emotion, which is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to eliminate the emotion when next we meet, so that we can get the emotion out of the way and see what the argument that I'll be presenting is at its core. So an appeal to emotion is the attempt to gain support through one's emotion rather than the objective substance of the argument. Now, here's one example. And before I go on to the example, I want to say that whenever you get into a study that's as abstract as what we're talking about here, how to train the mind, You need a lot of examples. You need the substance of what we're trying to say. In other words, we need the explanation in the abstract, and then we need instances. We need examples before the student really gets it. So we'll go through a number of case studies with each one of these, and if you don't get a particular if you don't get the concept clear in your mind in your own studies, this is the path you take. You start looking for examples rather than trying to go through the abstraction itself. So, appeal to emotion. Here's an example. I need a raise in salary because my children are economically deprived. Rather than, I deserve a raise because of the increase in productivity my innovations have brought to the firm. Now, the first sentence was appealing to the boss's emotion, and it's used a lot. I mean, just look at the news, and you'll see people trying to appeal to your emotion all the time, especially with commercials. But also, it's making its way more and more into what we call reporting the news. So whenever you feel your heartstrings being tugged, and it doesn't seem to fit the situation, give yourself a little time out and see if this is an appeal strictly to your emotion. And that doesn't mean you have to write it off right then. Now you can lead a question, get into a series of questions to see if this is just the motivating factor, and that's usually what emotions are. They motivate and give us our satisfactions in life. But if there's not an objective and more meaningful appeal, then you can, with confidence, leave that particular argument, an appeal to emotion. Now the next one is related. It's called special pleading. And this is typically referring to God's will. Now this is removing the arguer one step away so that you can't attack the arguer for his argument because it's God's will. And whenever you remove yourself one step, you're insulating yourself. One of the things that we can all relate to here, those of us who earn a living, is the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, is demonized. And when in fact it's the Congress that passed the Internal Revenue Service Act. They're the ones that passed our taxation, our federal taxation. But they set up this straw man, in effect, to take all the heat. So whenever you go to your congressman and start complaining about taxes, he just says, "Well, what can I do? It's God's will. It's the IRS that's bringing this misery onto you." So I'll do what I can. See you next election. So there's the special pleading. You're injecting another party into the mix of the argument. And the next one is called begging the question. Its Latin name is petitio principii, and this is assuming an answer in the way the question is phrased. It's like a leading question, or using the question at issue to reach a conclusion at that same issue. For example, you walk into a bank and go up to a loan officer and say you want to make an application for a loan, and the loan officer says, "Well, you don't have any history with us. I can't really extend any consideration." And the man says, "Well, I thought of that, so I brought my neighbor along, and he'll tell you what a reliable individual I am." And the banker says, "Well, I don't know your neighbor." And you say, Well, that's all right. I've known him for a number of years, and I can vouch for his reliability. So there you are, going in circles. This is the type of thing that you see in a very in a much more subtle fashion. But that's what you're looking for, is the same argument repeated over and over. You'll also see this in dictionary definitions. What is mortification? Well, mortification has to do with the terms of death, with those things that relate to death. Now, you're using a different word, but you're still close enough. Mortification is just Latin, or the Romance language of death. So what you're trying to do is not use the same term when you're defining. And you can go through the dictionary, especially more modern dictionaries, and see circular reasoning begging the question just all over the place. You'll go to a particular term, and you'll have to go to 2 or 3 other different concepts before you finally understand what it means. Let's see, a non sequitur, the Latin term for it does not follow. The logic falls down. It's cold today. Well, it was cold yesterday. Now, that may have a seasonal component to it. It seems to follow. But if you're getting into an in-depth analysis, just going back to the appearance is not enough to bring forth validity or new knowledge. Non sequitur is very subtle. You have to find a term within it that relates to neither one of the concepts that you have in the statement or in the argument. This one takes a lot of study and a lot of examples before you start to understand it. So I won't try to get into it too much here. The next one I like just because it's musical. Its Latin name is called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which literally means it happened after, so it was caused by. So this is the confusion of cause and correlation. For example, a comet appearing in the sky coincides with the start of a drought. And of course, it's mistakenly thought to be the cause of the drought. So that's a coincidence. But particularly in ancient times, the star watchers came upon this quite a bit. This is the basis of superstition.
It's like the U.S. being attacked on 911, and the television evangelist would say, that's because of homosexuals and gay marriage.
Yeah, there's a good one. I mean, that's propaganda, just out and out. Come visit us because we have an agenda here, and we'll try to help you lead a less sinful life. But that's exactly it. In fact, that's the basis of superstition. Something happens, a mirror breaks in your house, and you're going to have 7 years bad luck, or you're rolling craps at a casino, and you've noticed that every time you roll a 4, you get your point. You'll roll another 4 before you crap out. So all you concentrate on is that 4. Well, all this time that you're concentrating on it, of course, you're losing money right and left. You're not playing the odds. You're playing the post hoc ergo propter hoc. Now, I believe this other one we've already touched on to a degree. It's the one aspect of the Hegelian dialectic. In our last conversation, this was the aspect of controlled opposition, or staging opposition to an issue in order to claim the prearranged outcome, which had been tested by objective debate. For example, the contemporary American political structure, which declares having two independent parties, but in fact has only one with a common agenda, which up to this period of time has been big government, more and more big government. Controlled opposition is being used extensively in this country with these mega churches, these churches that are not affiliated with an Orthodox Christian church. They have large auditorium type facilities, and when you go in, they ask you to start going to a Bible study, and these Bible studies will almost invariably have 8 people as members, and one of the lay instructors will gather this group of 8 people and start a conversation regarding the Bible. Well, unbeknownst to the other 7, there's one in there that's a plant, and he's working with the instructor by sowing the seeds of where the instructor wants to take them at coffee breaks, periods of time when the instructor isn't around. The plant will come up with whatever the agenda might be, and of course the agenda is always to have you tithe 10 to 15% by coming to an agreement, a pre-arranged agreement. So when you see your supposed discussion group all coming to the same conclusion, you think, well, there's truth to be had here, because we've all independently come to this one outcome. And of course they were led by the plant, by the shill. And that, oddly enough, came about from the Delphi technique, which was developed back in the 1950s to have think tank organizations, the Rand Corporation, Rockefeller Foundation, whatnot, come to a consensus. And they didn't want an input. They wanted the parties, the 8 parties, to be separate. And when they did start to see a pattern emerging in consensus, then they could follow that strand wherever it was leading. And this just shows how you can take something designed for one purpose and think 180 degrees away and apply it for another purpose. So that's controlled opposition, and that's one thing that we can be aware of whenever we turn on the tube to watch the news, because you'll see the debate, supposed debate going on, and it's heading them off at the pass. Well, surely our leaders can do better than this. And as soon as they see enough opposition going in the other direction, they send a shill out there. One of the men that's currently playing that role, from what I understand, is Ron Paul. He says all the right things, but of course, what can one man do? But whenever we start to have an insight that we should go in that direction, he's put out there to voice as our voice, and it soon dies down, and they go on to the next one. Healthcare is one of those at the moment. Straw man, equivocation. Now, last session you mentioned half-truths. Half-truths fall within this logical fallacy. It's restatement or misstatement, using a term in 2 different senses in the same argument. It's also suppressed evidence or half-truths. And this is the most subtle form of bearing false witness against one's neighbor, really. 1 out of 4 children are born in China. I'm sorry, 1 out of 4 children born are Chinese. Mrs. Jones is getting ready to have her 4th child. Jan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I guess I was just so entranced and kind of just listening, I just let it go for a minute.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, equivocation, again, can be a very subtle argument. Because we don't know what's being hidden. When you're given a half-truth, we all have the tendency to want resolution. So as soon as we resonate with what we think is the truth, we cease being critical. And this, as you can see, can tie into the emotional argument. Now there are other subsets of this. Another one is the use of weasel words and phrases, such as we haven't seen this for a while, but using the term police action for war to get around limitations on presidential power. Now, this was used as an example when there was such a thing as limitations on presidential power. So that's one of the important arts of politicians, is to find new names for institutions which under old names have become odious. We had discussed last week Bernays coming up with the idea of public relations to be used in place of propaganda. So this is the equivocation, or the subset of equivocation. Another subset of this very often used fallacy is argumentum ad nauseum, and that's convince them that what is repeated incessantly is true. In other words, wear them down, like filibuster, mass media, repetitive advertising, or what we're experiencing right now with the propaganda for healthcare here in the U.S. So this gives you a small arsenal of logical fallacies. They're very easily found in Introduction to Logic books. There's a number of logic books out there that carry these. Also on the internet. Carl Sagan, in fact, in his book The Demon-Infested World, had a list in there that he called, and I think this goes right to the heart of it, he called it the baloney detection kit. So when any of these fallacies come up, it's a red light. Baloney's coming your way. Now, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle called his list of fallacies the refutation of the sophists. Now, the sophists were a school of thought in his time, in Aristotle's time, that didn't believe in anything. They thought that truth could not be ascertained. That the only thing that you could do is to live the life of advantage. That arguing was not, because truth could not be known, arguing could not be used as a method to come to a true statement. So they used argumentation as a means of winning a disputation. They didn't care about coming to truth. They just came to a position where they wanted to win the argument. And they're the ones that came up with or utilized many of these logical fallacies. And you can see in the American judicial system, that's still the case. Theoretically, the trial is to come to the truth, to come to justice. But in fact, it's about winning your case. And the person who can use the fallacies most adroitly is generally the winner of the case. So it's prevalent through all ages. Now, as I say, there's not one particular list of fallacies, but once you become conversant with some of these, you can see the fallacies in everyday language and entertainment, so-called news, and so forth. But you can also question a lot of the assumptions, particularly in the fields of history and science, as they've been presented to us, by applying these logical fallacies. So now we'll go on to the next section, the third of the 4 subjects, which is the rules of definition. Now, the object here is to devise a method by which to isolate the essence of a word or concept. And it was in the West that the philosopher Socrates, who was one of Plato's teachers, came to be known as the father of definition. He said that his emphatic prescription to clear the muddle, contradiction, and confusions of men's minds was to define your terms. Terms, as he used it, was words. So his idea was, before you started an argument or a disputation, that the two parties, or the parties that are going to be involved, define the words before they got into the argument. In other words, define the word justice, define the word cruel, and so forth. And when you come to an impasse in an argument, when you're actually coming to the idea of looking for truth, when there is an equivocation between two people, that is, one person is using a word in one sense and another is using it in another, you stop the argument per se, and define the term. Come to an agreement about the term as it relates to that argument. So Aristotle comes along after Socrates, and with his scientific mind decides that he wants to make this methodical. He wants to make a system of it. So he comes up with the formulation that a term must be stated in positive terms, describing what a concept is, not what it is not, or possible. For example, I'd already made mention of this, that innocence is a positive term, but the definition of necessity has to be negative. Innocence is the absence of guilt. Guilt is a positive term that is defined positively. It is the commission of an act, usually a cruel or unjust act. Freedom is a positive term defined by lack of constraint. So it's a positive term that must be given in a negative description. Man is known as the rational animal. Now, he's not known as the laughing animal, or the animal that's always in heat, or the animal with the most dexterous opposing digit on his hand. Even though he is all these things, he is the only one that is rational. That is, going back to the definition of rational, is he who can see and use ratios. And of course, I think I mentioned that there is no other animal that shows evidence of being able to do that. And all that stems from being able to see and use a ratio. So that is a positive term of a positive description of a positive term, man. So Aristotle also came to, after that recommendation, he says, you want to seek a term, a reckoning, which is not too broad or too narrow or too circular or too vague for the term. Too broad, too generalized, too narrow, getting too much into the specifics and disregarding the genera. Too circular, which goes to petitio. You don't want to use a circular, use the same word to try to prove that word. Or too vague, which is the fallacy of half-truths, the fallacy of equivocation. So you use all those fallacies in these tips, in these ways of coming to a definition. The best way I found is, because we have such well-researched dictionaries, is to start with the dictionary term. And if you're lucky enough, go back to a dictionary that's a number of decades old, back in the 30s and especially pre-1920, and compare the two, if it's a concept that's important to you. So, as we go along into argument, we'll find that we'll be able to define not just individual words, but entire propositional sentences, and finally whole arguments. And our inconsistency, our mental inconsistency through practice, will be replaced by clarity. So the final two segments of logic are the rules of deductive reasoning and a guide for inductive reasoning. And those are pretty abstract statements, but they really just refer to what the brain does. The mind just mentally takes things apart and mentally puts things together. That's all it does. It does nothing else other than become emotional. But but when we're in analysis and synthesis, which are just other words for deductive and inductive, that's all it does. So, from the base of immediate logical inference, which derives a conclusion from a single preceding statement or implication, Aristotle again came up with a three-termed argument, which he called a syllogism, which in Greek just means connected discourse. But we do this all the time. We see a wild animal, let's say. We see a bear in the woods. Well, that is part of a family that we already know as a predator. So we're putting a general principle of predator together with this, say, fishing, this bear that's fishing the stream. So of course we see he's a predator, and he belongs in that category. So we're putting things together. We have a general principle, and we're putting together a specific instance. So the direction of this way of thinking is from specific to general. Sherlock Holmes, famous for deducing by seeing a scuff on a man's shoe at a particular height, for example. He can tell that he was in a particular room that had a door that opened to that height, and that's what scuffed his shoe as he came up and jammed his shoe under the door. So we know that objects scuff leather. So that's the general statement. Then the deduction is that he was in that room, that that Holmes is trying to place him in, say at the time of the murder, which it invariably is. This is going from genera to specifics, which is also part of where we just came from, which was part of definition. In definition, where possible, we look for genera, which is to place a term in a category that we already can recognize that it belongs to. Just as we saw the bear must be part of the predator genera. The bear was the species. When we are working with concept definition, with word definition, we call that the differentia. We call the species the differentia. In other words, it's the word that fits in the general category, but the thing that makes it different from every other member of its category, of its genera, is this specific thing. Like the differentia of man is rational, that he can see and utilize ratios. So that's the differentia. Or in rules of analysis, that's the species, general and specific. Now, the rules of the syllogism and the rules of deduction are thoroughly known. I mean, they're exhaustively known. So when you get into the study of an introduction to logic, when you get to this particular area, deduction, it's the most technical. The way an argument is put together, the syntax of the argument are important. If you put an argument together in a particular way, there's almost no out but to come to a valid or a truthful conclusion. Now, the syllogism, which, as I say, is pretty technical, we can give an instance of it and see how it works. And the classical syllogism is, and most of us have heard this, there are three statements. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So from the general statement of all men are mortal to the specific statement that here's another man, and his name happens to be Socrates. Therefore, this man named Socrates is mortal. And the structure of this is if, then, therefore. So if we restated this, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is not mortal. Just from that structure, we can see that all men are mortal. This man named Socrates is a man. This man, Socrates, is immortal. The logic does not follow. So we have to keep going back until we get the structure right. And of course, we start with a valid general term and a valid specific term. And we should be able to come out with the proper answer, if, then, therefore. This generally leads to what in philosophy is called certainty. When you're thinking deductively, you come to a certain conclusion. And that's a dubious word, certain. But in philosophy, when you understand the limitations that it puts on itself as to what certainty is, which means that it's contextual, within a certain context, all these things hold. And that again goes to some of the technicality within deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning generally leads you to that idea of certainty through a spectrum of evidence. The first part of that spectrum is that the conclusion might be possible. In other words, there is some amount of evidence for the conclusion. but not a preponderance of evidence. And this is something else we've heard in courts, in legal situations. The preponderance of evidence is not there. The next level before certainty is called probable. In this part of the spectrum, there is a preponderance or a majority of evidence for the conclusion. And then, of course, the final level is that of certainty. And here's where the context comes in. All of the gathered evidence points to the conclusion, and there is no evidence against it. So the evidence is conclusive and theoretically certain. The term theoretical didn't come into use until the next mode of thinking, the mode beyond philosophic, came into prominence. And of course, that was the scientific mode, where everything must be demonstrated. And all witnesses to that demonstration come to the same conclusion. Well, until you come upon various facts, you're not trying a person, trying to come to a specific conclusion about guilt or innocence in science. You're trying to come to a generalization, a general conclusion. And until evidence comes up against your theory, that holds. But it's open to more evidence coming in, unlike in philosophy, where you run up against this wall of certainty just because evidence is all for and there is no evidence against. So now we come to the guide for inductive reasoning. And the reason it's called a guide is it's about generalizing. And we really don't know how concepts are put together. We don't know how Aristotle gave us an inkling that we see an object, we form a concept in our mind, and then we form a means of communicating it, like a word. But we really don't know how we come upon this concept. Now, if you're part of the entheogenic way of thinking, if you're part of the psychedelic school of thought, we know how these come into being. We're shown, we're told. The medicines speak to us. The universe speaks to us. Whatever. Then we go back and deduce from there. Yes, this insight that was given to me can be proven in this specific instance. But because logicians don't hold up credence, or at least they don't hold up public credence to entheogenic insight, it's not part of our everyday vernacular. So all we can say about induction, or really the art of generalizing, of validly generalizing, is that we come upon an observation with one of our five senses. And we see that it appears to be a feature in reality. Like one of the first applications of generalizing, or of explaining the theory of generalizing, was to look at axiomatic synthesis, which defines self-evident, irreducible axioms like existence, causality, and consciousness, which was known to the ancients, or a geometric form. A circle is self-evident, a square is self-evident. Whoever is sighted and looks at that and is rational will always agree that those things are self-evident. Now, existence, although I've given a definition for it, in the final analysis, it's just like trying to describe red to a person who's never been sighted. All you can do is point. Now, what is existence? It's that. What is consciousness? It's somewhere within the skull. That's the best place to point. Causality. That seems to be an action that causes a lower level action, but we really can't give it a definition. So the next method of generalizing was what was called perfect or enumerative induction, which was hypothetically to observe every instance of a phenomenon before advancing a general statement of principle. So that's essentially saying you have to know everything before knowing anything. So enumerative synthesis really just leads to probabilities. You see a number of instances, so you make the statement. And this is really where science took off from. How do we test ourselves a little bit more intensely, so that we can come up with a better statement? And we'll always leave the door open by calling it a theory. Yes, this appears to be true with all the indications and evidence we have now, but because we have a realization that we don't know everything, we can't say that it's definitive. It's true enough. That's what science really is. It's true enough for this particular task or this particular set of concepts that are usable. So in science, of course, we have theories rather than certainties. So you can see the advancement in the modes of knowledge. It was Francis Bacon who hinted at what the scientific method was. And it's the scientific method which is really our greatest method of generalizing. And the scientific method consists of four actions. The first one is to observe. The second one is to generate hypotheses. The third is to extrapolate. And the fourth is to demonstrate an experiment, a repeatable experiment. So the first segment is to observe reality, to try to explain a phenomenon, a physical phenomenon within the universe. So we define that objective. Secondly, we go to attempted explanations by generating hypotheses. Now, hypotheses are generated by analogy. We find the similarities between the phenomena, the new phenomena, and known phenomena, and we come up with a number of hypotheses, sometimes not even related. This is just blue sky thinking. And from the most likely hypothesis that we've generated after a thought process, we extrapolate from that most likely hypothesis to come to an even more refined understanding. We can liken this to generating a blueprint. A blueprint for what? Well, it's a blueprint for designing an experiment. And as we refine the experiment, the blueprint for the experiment, and we think we're ready to carry out the experiment in the real world, we perform it. We perform the experiment, and then we make sure that it is a repeatable experiment, that other parties, other people can devise this experiment. And that's how we prove our scientific theory. From this experiment, we come up with a statement, a written statement of theory. So this is proven to be the most efficacious way of using the guidelines for inductive thinking that we've devised. And in the modern world, you can see this reflected all over the place. One of them is in medicine. A physician will examine the patient. Then he will take the symptoms that he's seen and diagnose from those symptoms as to what the malady might be. Thirdly, he uses a process called prognosis, which is to take from the most likely diagnosis what the treatment might be. It might be a drug therapy or it might be a surgery, depending on what his diagnosis was. Part of the prognosis is also to, in his own mind, determine what the efficacy of that treatment might be. And then finally, he carries out the treatment. Now notice that in the scientific method and in medicine, we went from reality, observation, or examination, to hypothesis, or in medicine, that's diagnosis. And from the hypothesis, we went to the extrapolation of the most likely, from the most likely hypothesis. In medicine, we went to prognosis from the most likely diagnosis, and finally, down to action by either performing the experiment or treating the patient. Now let's look at what this process really is. It's the process of going from reality, from observation, to a process completely in mentality, which is hypothesis formation, or in the case of the physician, diagnosis. And next down, we go to extrapolation from the most likely hypothesis. And this is a completely mental exercise also. Prognosis, likewise with the physician. It's a completely mental exercise that's more focused than the mental exercise just above it. And finally, we take it back into the real world, into an experiment or to a treatment. So the process that is common to both of them is going from reality to, let's say, a shotgun view of mentality, of our own mind, from whatever we saw from whatever we observed in the real world, to a rifle shot, which is the second, the third level down, the second mental exercise. That's the rifle shot. That's the one that's more focused, and finally back to reality, to take action. So this is, if you look at it without the two steps in the middle of the shotgun mental exercise and the rifle mental exercise, you can actually break this down into 3 steps, which again takes us back to the trivium. With grammar, we take observations of the real world and put together a body of knowledge, of similar knowledge. In logic, it's a completely mental process. We take what we've learned from our body of knowledge and brought understanding. Now, coming to an understanding is a completely mental exercise. And then we express it in the real world, or utilize it in the real world as wisdom or rhetoric. Wisdom, remember, is the use of knowledge and understanding in the real world. So that pretty much covers the areas of the trivium. And once we have trained our minds, or come to a general understanding, a conversant understanding of the trivium, we can move on from the methods of training and using the mind critically and creatively. We can now move on to the realm of extension, or the quadrivium. Now, the quadrivium, the 4 classical subjects in the quadrivium are mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, those are our modern methods of looking at it. Pythagoras put this group of subjects together, or at least he's given credit, I must add. He's given credit in our culture, in our version of Western culture, as being the one who put these together. And the common denominator that he used was number. Now, another aspect that's been hidden from us over the years is that of number. We generally think of number as being ways to count, and that's all it is. You count out a measurement, or you count out a probability. But I had already mentioned in our last session that numbers have qualities, and they're not just for counting. They're for making analogies. For example, 1 is unity. 2 is the first division. 3 is the first number, beginning, middle, end. 4 is the first encompassment, the box. 5 is the first number of life. 5 in a lot of cultures marries male and female. For example, what it's made up of, it's factors. 2 and 3 also means male and female. 2 is female in a lot of cultures, and 3 is male, and the opposite. It's the thing that makes up water. A water molecule, an H2O molecule, always has an angle that would make up a pentagon. So water in its liquid state makes up a solid geometric figure called an icosahedron, which is made up of a series of pentagons, and this is where the water comes in. Makes up the corners of the pentagons. But this is why water is called in its liquid form a fluid crystal. Again, getting back to 5 as that which brings about life. 5s are found in apples, flowers, hands, and feet. One of the interesting points here does not have to do necessarily with life, but it's the planet Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Draws a 5-fold pattern around Earth every 8 years, and we see this symbol in a lot of places. It's the pentacle, the pentagram inside a circle, and that's to show the path of Venus when it meets up with Earth. Every 584 days, it comes close to Earth, and over a period of 8 years, it forms that star pattern inside a circle. And this is a symbol of the United States Air Force, for example. So we see that in there. The next number is 6, and it's the first perfect number. Now, the idea of number in the quadrivium is that we're explaining what the qualities of the quantities are, and 6 is the first perfect number. Its factors, which are part of their qualities, the things that divide into it, all add up to 6. The first 3 digits, 1 times 6, and 2 times 3 are 6. But you add those up, 1, 2, 3, the first 3 integers, and you come up with 6. And that's the first perfect, what's called the first perfect number. There's only one perfect number between 1 and 10. There's only one perfect number between 10 and 100. That would be 28, the number 28. And there's one perfect number between 100 and 1,000, and so forth. So these are the qualities in mathematics. This is what properly we should be taught when we're taught the quadrivium, the qualities of the quantities, the story behind the number itself. Now, number, math, exists outside of space and time. So number just refers to itself outside of space and time. It's an abstraction. It's a human abstraction. And this idea of number relating to itself goes to the next 3 subjects. Geometry is number in space. Music, or actually harmonic theory, is number in time. And astronomy, or really what we might more properly call cosmology, is number in space and time. So this is how Pythagoras, let's say, integrated those four subjects in that they all relate to number. They're all measurable. When we get to geometry, we can measure, as we did with the Pythagorean triangle, the numbers that make it up. And we can relate these numbers to all geometric patterns and symbols. So this is number in space. We can find edges and faces and vertices of polygons, for example, that are geometric shapes. Next we go to harmonic theory. And this is number in time or interval rather than space. So there are only so many of all sounds that can be made in the various in the various vibrations that are harmonic, and they're the octaves. There are eight notes within the octave, and they're all separated by a space, and that's a space of interval, a space of time. And this is what we're measuring when we're measuring harmonics. All the other sounds that can be made in the other various frequencies are discordant. So the harmonies are concordant. Within each octave, there are 6 other divisions. The fifth, the fourth, the ninth, which is a whole tone, 9/8. It's the study of fractions within time. And finally, we get to the study of cosmology, where we marry space and time. And I already made mention of that by describing Venus to you. By forming that pinnacle every 8 years, when we have a synod, when we have we come closest to Venus, that's called a synod. If we follow that over a period of 8 Earth years, we have that geometric figure of the pinnacle, and it's married to that interval of 8 years. So this is where you get the idea of space and time. There are all sorts of concordances in our solar system, for example, that the ancients knew of, this being only one. Another concordance or observation that they made was that the mean orbit, that is, all the planets travel in an ellipse, but when you calculate the mean orbit or the circular orbit around the sun, you'll see, for example, that the planet Mercury relates to the size of the Earth in the same proportion that the orbit of the planet Mercury relates to the size of the Earth orbit. So the orbit and the physical sphere itself have the same ratio to one another. And there are various ratios around the solar system that were well known and observed through the millennia. Another being that of the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. They form a 6-sided star, a hexagram, derived from a hexagram. And there are far more. There's relationships between Earth and the Moon and so on and so forth. Well, when Isaac Newton came to study these things, I remember when I was in school and I was taught that he was observing an apple falling from a tree, and the idea of the laws of gravity came to him, and I could never make the connection as to what that had to do with anything. And what he was doing was imagining a pulling force at a distance. In other words, he imagined the Earth pulling the apple. Well, I still couldn't make that connection. He was aware of all of these coincidences in the solar system, all these geometric patterns as they related over time. And he looked for the common. There was something that was making these patterns and putting these this music of the spheres together. And he knew what those relationships were. This is the music of the spheres along with the geometry of the spheres. And what he found was this ratio, this squaring ratio, that if you imagine a pulling force, that force decreases by the square of the distance. And in the other direction, it increases by a simple square. If something is 10 units away, it has a particular attractive force. When you move that to 20 units away, you multiply 10 times 10. In other words, it's twice as far, but the force is 1/10 rather than 1/2. It's 1/10 of what it is. And this all coincided with the geometry these coincidental geometries that he observed in the solar system.
So what you're saying is that the apple isn't a metaphor for the mushroom?
Well, it could be. I think that he was known to have partaken of direct knowledge. He was known to have experimented with inductive thought processes. No, I think he actually saw the apple, but that's not to say that he didn't gain the insight of putting those age-old observations together with the help of the plants, of the medicines. I know that other people in science, well, of course, we know of the modern biologists and microbiologists that supposed what the structure of DNA was, or in the 19th century, the chemist who came up with the structure of benzene by thinking of the Ouroboros, the serpent with the tail in its mouth. And where do you get these? You know,
the Ouroboros, yeah.
Yeah.
I just can't help but think, with this talk about all of the geometric formations and things like that, that's one of the primary things that people report under the influence of psychedelic drugs is geometric formations, and going into the worlds where it's all these different geometric formations and things. So that's interesting.
Well, that's the first stage. I have my own personal method of describing various states, and to me, that's the hallucinogenic state. And they're common to all of us. When we're speaking to the plants or to the chemicals, whatever they may be, we have very similar experiences. Now, this is why I have an emphasis that education consists of the 7 liberal arts plus the direct experience of. I think you have to go, in my terminology, to the level of entheogens. This is when you see God. This is when you lose your atheism.
Right, and you've moved past all of your fear of all of the emotional-based propaganda regarding these things, and then you can approach them in a mature way, ready to experiment with them for what they're really meant to do.
Well, you can use them in complement. I like Stanislav Grof's terms for the various states. He calls it an ordinary state and a non-ordinary state. Now, direct experience to me is the non-ordinary state. Ordinary states are where you can apply the trivium and quadrivium. Now, they can be used in concert, like I've used them. When I had my graduation at age 18 into direct experience, the trivium, which I had been drilled in, just came into such a focus, such a defined focus, that for the rest of my life I could use those two in concert. Now, I've also seen, I've heard trip reports of people that have attracted me to this, because what the terms that they use, they said that taking a psychedelic shows you how to think. Now, this is exactly what the
Right.
trivium is. It is a method of how to think. So, see, you can come to these realizations in either realm, in either an ordinary or non-ordinary. But when you start using them complementarily, that's when you get the insight in your ordinary state, as I would say, when you can start putting words to some of the experience that are ineffable, these experiences that are just short of words, that are just sight, hearing, sound, touch, and taste, which you can't put into words. So that's why I say that they're complementary. When I use the analogy, or maybe I'd already mentioned this, the syllogism with Socrates. Did I make the analogy as to where did Socrates come from? Well, let me just,
I think you may have, but go ahead again.
Well, the question has always been, when utilizing that example, is when you're putting things together, when you're reasoning deductively, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And the question's always been, well, where did this idea of immortality, or where did the idea of Socrates come from? And I say it came from the various materials that speak to us. So we get, of course, we don't do this in our current culture, but we can get into the argument. That is, to find the truth of what came first, the chicken or the egg. And I tend to go along with Terence McKenna's idea that it was the plant kingdom, if we want to call it that brought about our higher states of ordinary realization. I think that's where our knowledge originated, and we're just refining it in our ordinary states.
Would you like to review for us once more what the importance of this has been to your life of learning?
Well, I can give you the chronology, because from my seat in life now, as I'm coming to the last stage, I can look back on my life and review it in such clarity and with such new insights at this point that I can see various points along the way that were pivotal. And of course, I didn't know it at the time when I had my guru, so to speak, who was letting me in on the trivium, that would be the long range strategy that I'd use. But my first initiation, my graduation, of course, was at age 18, when I had direct experience through LSD. And that was pivotal. I mean, I can point to that as being one of the pivotal times in my life. And then from there on, when I went into the second stage of life, of receiving from life, that's when I lived the actions of a person, of having a career, having a family, and so on and so forth. And then I hit that age of 55, 56, and there just seemed to be something that was going on in my psyche. I didn't know what. But you tend to review, or many of us, if you're of my type, we tend to review our lives. And one day, for some odd reason, I came upon your website. And I don't even know why. I think I was looking up something on Gnosticism. And I saw your book, the book that you wrote with Andrew Rajaji, Astrotheology and Shamanism. And there were just some intriguing things that I just intuitively went to. So I ordered the book. And I opened it up. And I went through it in 2 days. And this, I can honestly say, was another pivotal point in my life. All these somewhat fuzzy ideas in my mind as I reviewed my life came into a focus that I had in an ordinary state, as I had at age 18 when I was in an unordinary state. When I saw you explaining astrotheology, it just took me back to my childhood, when my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, who was quite a sky watcher, instructed me as to what was happening there in that city of Las Cruces, which had a large mountain to the east side. So I became to the east side of the city. So I became very aware of, under her guidance, as to how the sun, the moon, the stars rose above the peaks there. That's why I mentioned at the very beginning of our first interview that this place had a meaning to me. Well, when I was reading your treatment on astrotheology, all that just came pouring in, and all of a sudden, religion, organized religion, made sense to me, how it had evolved, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when I went to the shamanistic portion, the idea of direct awareness, then everything else that was lying fuzzy in my mind came into focus. So I wanted to thank you and give a recommendation to people who have not read the book to get it, because as I say, it was one of those transformative moments in my life when those subjects were made explicit. The fuzziness that I had was in those ideas being implicit, but you two made those ideas explicit and opened up a whole new world of investigation for me, and that's led to the adventures that a senior person can now have, the adventures in mentality.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
All right. Do you have any last words? Would you like to give out any contact information or anything like that for the audience?
Well, my last word is to claim your humanity by learning on your own and thinking for yourself. And I think I might be able to give my source material. I've gathered up a bibliography and a couple of articles that I've written that might succinctly give the ideas that we've been discussing the last two sessions in written form. And if you just contact me at 534 Trivium, and I think we all know how to spell that by now, TRIVIUM, at gmail.com. That's 534 Trivium at gmail.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I definitely appreciate all of the information and you sharing this so vividly for the audience and for myself as well. And I look forward to having you come back on the show again sometime soon to talk about, well, you had a couple of different topics I think that you wanted to talk about. Maybe we'll have to do two shows.
Well, let's see how the next one goes and how it might take us into the next topic. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that, Jan.
Great. All right. Well, I'll be in touch with you soon for that. And I guess that's it.
Okay.